to say hello through the chat box and tell us where you're coming from. And we want to know who's there watching, and we want to get started here in just a minute. So wherever you're at, take just a moment, say hello, say good morning, and we will get started with Randy in just a moment. Randy, this is a great book, The Right Call, and I'm excited for you to present it. I want to say to everybody, if you haven't watched a Wednesday webinar with Randy Mayeux before, Randy's worked with SGR for a long time, predating me, and I think predating Chrissa, if I'm remembering right. But we've all been around this company for a long time, and we have grown a lot intellectually from Randy's presentations. Randy is a great reader, reads I don't know how many books a month, and does book briefings for us, and also does those for the private sector. And this is one that he originally mentioned to me. He said, Mike, I think you're going to like this book. It's called The Right Call by Sally Jenkins, best-selling author and great sports journalist. But this book is not really about sports, Randy, is it? It's more about life and our work ethic. And so we're really excited for you to present it. And I want to just turn this over to you and give you all the time you need to share this book with us.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Chrissa. Thanks, everybody. I do a couple of things at the beginning of my presentation. The first one is I take my headphones off. So, Mike, while you're still on, if you'll wave your arms, if you can hear me okay. Okay, good. All right. So that's number one. Number two, let me give you just a little more piece of what it is I do. Mike introduced the fact that I've been doing these book briefings for many years. I have actually been doing kind of version one of all of these at an event in Dallas called the First Friday Book Synopsis for 26 solid years. I used to have a colleague at that. He would present one book, I would present another. A number of years ago, he had a stroke. And so now I present two book briefings or book synopses every single month. And we have presented over 625 books at that event in the 26 plus years of the event. I also do books on poverty, homelessness, racial justice type issues at another event called the Urban Engagement Book Club every third Thursday of the month. And so if you put all of the books that I have presented together, it is truly well over 600. So I read books, I read every word of the book, I look for the themes and the lessons to pull out of them, and they end up in a handout like this. And I hope you've got the handout in front of you with a pen in hand. Now, I'm going to tell you a story related to this book that is a terrific story. I presented this book for a team within Cisco about 2 or 3 weeks ago. And at the end of the presentation, one of the team members said, let me tell everybody a story. One of the points in the book is that work ethic by these great athletes continues after their athletic career is over. So this guy on the Cisco team said, I recently got on a plane in Denver, and lo and behold, sliding into the seat next to me was Peyton Manning. And here's what he said about his flight with Peyton Manning. He said he was cordial, said hello, but no time for small talk. And for the entire flight, he went over meticulous notes, page by page, marking in the margins, looking at every piece of it. And this guy said, I could tell that he was preparing for some kind of television gig that he was doing. And so he went over his notes meticulously. And he also added this comment. He said, man, did that guy hydrate. So he drank a lot of water and he went over the notes. And there's a hint about the work ethic transfer into a second chapter of life for Peyton Manning. And after reading this book, I am not surprised. So this book, The Right Call, What Sports Teach Us About Work and Life, is written by Sally Jenkins, a Hall of Fame sports writer. And she has especially got a lot of publicity or visibility about a year ago, give or take, for an article she wrote about the deep and abiding rivalry and friendship and closeness, because they both suffer from cancer, between Chris Evert and Martina Navratilova. So make a note in the margin to Google Sally Jenkins' article on Chris Evert and Martina Navratilova. It's a great article. And so this woman is a Hall of Fame sports writer. She has full access to athlete after athlete and coach after coach. And this book is, and I'm going to oversimplify, but this book is about the work ethic of the best athletes, and not just how hard they work, but how smart they work with coaches. I'm getting ahead of myself. So at the front of the handout, get your pen. Here we go. The top of the handout. What is the point? Winning in sports, in business, in life, involves developing the ability to do the right thing at the right time, even when the pressure is on. The lessons of what works in sports apply across the board. And so the title, The Right Call, is about making the right call in a moment of pressure, making a right call in the moment building up to that with practice and with disciplined practice, with coaching. It's about putting yourself in a position to doing what is best at the moment that is needed. So why is this book worth our time? Well, number one, this book is a gold mine of great sports stories. And I want to comment that many of the sports books I've presented, sports-related books on leadership and work ethic and team effort, many of them focus primarily on males in sports, men and men's teams. Well, this book is a good cross-section of men and women in sports, and she wrote the definitive book on the great women's basketball coach. That's a bad phrase. The great basketball coach, Pat Summitt. And so she has a lot of stories about women in sports that other books do not have. So I like that about the book. Number two, this book helps explain that what sets the greatest sports figures apart has more to do with their discipline than it does with their luck, of their physiological advantages. Now, obviously, if I had worked every bit as hard as Michael Jordan to play basketball, I wouldn't have been Michael Jordan, because I didn't have his height, his wingspan. So there is some physiological advantages. The best quarterbacks are tall enough to see over the linemen, for example. So there is an advantage, but there are a whole lot of athletes who were born with the right body size and the right body capabilities that did not develop to the point of the greatest because they did not work at it. So that's an aside. Number three, this book is a tutorial on leadership for leaders in any and every arena, because there's a whole lot in here about what leaders have to do. Turn to page 2, and what we have now for the next few pages are the best of my highlighted passages from the book. So all of this is a direct excerpt from the book. I'm not going to read all of them. I encourage you to print this out and read through this handout, cover to cover on the handout, one time in the next 3 or 4 days. And remembering what I present today, that will help the book get into your heart and soul. When you see a quote in bold or a larger font, that is my emphasis. So I'm going to read many of those quotes. Get ready. Move together with me with your pens and handout. Number 5, I realize that I'm never going to be perfect, but as long as you strive to, at least you're going to get better. I don't ever want to make a mistake and say, that's all right, because then it becomes a part of you. I don't want mistakes to become a part of my life. And so that's a quote from one of the great athletes. I don't remember which one, and I failed to put it down. But it's the mindset of all of these. And by the way, make a mental note. We're going to talk in a few minutes about the athletic mindset from the book. All right, look at number 10. Most formal studies of leadership suffer from a fundamental weakness. You can't watch a CEO in live action, whereas coaches and playmakers make decisions in real time right before your eyes. So that's an advantage of watching sports. You can see them at work, whereas you can't see Bob Iger or Bill Gates or any of the great CEOs at work. You have to read about what they did afterwards. Turn to page 3, number 11. Elite performers are highly methodical in their processes, precisely because they deal in fluid situations. Consistent champions don't just drift through the circumstances of their day. Everything they do is deliberate. Remember, I commented about the meticulousness of Peyton Manning's preparation on that airplane flight. Everything they do is methodical. I remember years ago that Joe Buck commented that Troy Aikman prepared for every broadcast game the way he prepared for a game and a Super Bowl in his playing career. There's something about the work ethic that is not abandoned when they go to the second or third career. Number 12, if you ever hear a young talent say they want to play on instinct, you can mark them down as a probable bust. Not good, says Peyton Manning. It's like saying you don't want to prepare for a speech. You just want to talk from the heart. And an hour later, you've said nothing. I teach speech at the college level as an adjunct. And I can tell in a flash, which of my students rehearsed their speech and which ones did not at all. You can't get up with the notes you prepared and speak without going over them in advance. I have presented this book multiple times. I throw away my handout after every presentation. I go back to the handout, reprint it out, and go through it and mark my notes up to prepare for the next presentation. It's a way to refresh the preparation. Number 15 on page 3, watching Pat Summitt up close taught that it takes deeply learned experiential skills to lead teams and people to the right headings. It sparked the desire to articulate as clearly as possible what separates a person with these acquired skills from the legions of pretenders and imitators or toxic executives who create so much workplace misery and frustration and who never seem to learn how to lead or succeed, no matter how many seminars they attend. And so watching Pat Summitt taught Sally Jenkins what leadership is. Number 17, though we might be at the mercy of unpredictable forces, we can at least employ sound practices and over time increase our odds of being right more often than not. So at this point, if you were to just take your pen and write at the bottom of the page, I think I would write this phrase as the lesson so far. Meticulous preparation pays off. She's saying different ways of saying you've got to fully prepare. So I think that's what she's saying. Number 19, the brain robs your body of the energy to think. Just because you're sitting in a chair reading or typing, barely lifting your arms above desk level, doesn't mean you aren't physically working. You are quite strenuously, especially after 3 or 4 hours of sustained thought. I read a book and presented a book a while back called Deep Work by Cal Newport. And he says, if you try to work solid, intellectual focus, solid for 4 hours, you don't have a chance. You've got to build up to 4-hour capability. To be able to stay focused over a 4-hour period requires the preparation and training that an athlete has. And I think that's right. And so think about how easily you're distracted, how you leave your notifications on your phone and you're distracted. Think about the effort it takes to stay focused. That's that point. All right, turn to page 4. I'm already reaching the point where I'm going to have to do a little editing of what I read aloud. Number 20 on page 4. Open on a desk in front of him was a training notebook. This is related to Michael Phelps. I have 170 more days of this, Phelps said, pointing at it. Brutal. But it was worth it, he said, for what it gave him in the heat of competition. He knew that his strokes would hold up better than his rivals over the last abdominal torching few meters. When you're tired, it's just sort of easy to fall apart, Phelps observed. And this book has a lot to say about Michael Phelps' incredible discipline of practicing lap after lap after lap in the pool, so much so that he knew with every stroke where he should be, what the stroke should be, exactly every piece of that. It's a really remarkable story. Number 22, Michael Phelps would do a series of warm-up exercises, the same ones he'd been doing since he was 11 years old. And then it was my job to just sort of let it happen, Phelps said. I guess, you know, for so many years, I've done so many small things that have helped. Let me pause here a minute. We build good habits. And yet, even if we've done these habits for week after month after year, it is possible to lose the good habit that fast. Both the book, The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg and Atomic Habits by James Clear have stories about that, where people develop a good habit and then they just fall back into old patterns. I have had that as a lifelong battle with what I eat. And I'll go in a splurge of discipline, and then I'll lose my discipline. It's embarrassing. And so this really does remind you that you've got to keep at it over the long haul. Number 23, Phelps will give up today's fun for tomorrow's reward. And eventually, he will bury you with all the loose change that is the difference between his willpower and your itch for immediate gratification. Look at number 26. I'll just mention the point. Top chess players lose 10 pounds in a tournament play with a metabolic burn rate approaching 6,000 calories a day. It is work to work, even intellectually. Number 29, just the bold part. Athletes and chess players don't drink a Coke and eat a donut before a contest because they know they'll crater. The book doesn't do this, but you've now seen the kinds of drinks that tennis players and golfers drink at set times when they change sides or in between holes. There are now scientific experts saying, drink this at this point. So that's an added level of capability in today's athletes. Okay. Number 35. This is Bill Belichick and his team in 17 playoff games between 2011 and 2017. They were whistled for infractions at a 25% lower rate than their opponents. Think about that. When it came to game-killing mistakes, they were fully 1/4 better than their opponents. That's really provocative to me in explaining how thorough their training was. I live in Dallas. I'm a Dallas Cowboys fan. The Cowboys have been disappointing. Well, they haven't won a Super Bowl since Abraham Lincoln was president. It's been over 25 years. It is a tough time to be a Cowboys fan. And you can tell a problem by how many games they have with so many penalties called against them. Okay. Number 38. Circle number 38. What separates these elite athletes, the Hall of Famers, is that they try to get better every day. Not by 20%, but just 1 or 2%. They get better every day. It's number 39. It's not random and it's not luck. The lesson to take from them is utterly counterintuitive. The essence of their performance is not when they do something extraordinary and extreme under pressure, but rather the opposite. When they are at their best, they are simply performing in their usual, ordinary, and well-practiced way. That's really worth observing. Now, look at number 40. You don't get better by practicing purely in smooth conditions, and yet it's so tempting. I'm going to have to skip ahead. Look at page 6. I'm skipping a bunch of these quotes, so be sure to read them, especially the big font and the bold quotes. But number 51, a coach has to have the humility to ask for their input and the awareness that not every decision is going to pay off. That's Steve Kerr, the coach of the Golden State Warriors. What makes decisions hard is that there is no easy answer. There are two angles to them. Number one is the angle of how are my staff and I going to come up with the decision to a problem or an issue? And number two, how are we going to include the team? How is the team going to accept it? And those are equally as important. Number 52, if you're in a leadership position, you need to copy and paste 52 and put it in front of your eyeballs regularly. Pat Summitt once observed, in the absence of feedback, people will fill in the blanks with a negative. So they think they're doing badly. They'll fill in the blanks with a negative. You've got to give feedback, corrective feedback. We'll talk about that. And positive feedback. But don't skip the feedback. There's a new book by Adam Grant in which he says, I don't like the word feedback. I like the word advice. So you got to give advice based on what you've seen. Page 7, and look at number 64 and then 67, our last two quotes from this section. People have to grant their cooperation for any idea to work, no matter how brilliant you are. And if they distrust your intentions, it's over. They've got to trust that you have good intentions. This is the idea of goodwill. My graduate study is in rhetoric, the very famous formula from Aristotle: logos, pathos, ethos, logical appeal, ethical appeal, emotional appeal. But there is a real study on how to flesh those out. And one of them is that if you want to be persuasive, the audience has to believe that you are coming to them with your message with goodwill, that you intend the best for them with this message. And so that quote that I just read is very much a part of that, that if they distrust your intentions, it's over. All right, number 67, when people love their daily endeavor, they're the masters of themselves rather than prey to emotional turmoil and regret about what they're doing. Okay, turn to page 8, and I'm only going to read one of these, even though these are the thesis quotes, but I'm already getting short on time. Look at the first major quote on page 8. I asked Rod Laver. Now, let me pause. I was a ranked tennis player and went through college on tennis scholarship. Rod Laver is from my era. I'm an old guy. He is the only male who won 2 calendar year Grand Slams. And in the years in between the two, he was not allowed to participate because it was those few years when people who turned pro weren't allowed to play in Wimbledon and the US Open and the French Open and the Australian Open. So if you corner me, who's the greatest male tennis player ever, my answer is Rod Laver. No telling how many Grand Slams he would have won if he had been eligible then. So anyway, Sally Jenkins said, I asked Rod Laver if all major champions have something in common. Yes, Laver replied, they're all able to summon their best at the moments when they most need to. Who wouldn't like to be able to do that, no matter what the profession? I will read the next one. After spending time with Billie Jean King, listening to their talk about how tennis was less about talent than about mastering a craft, I sat down to write this book. Okay, turn to page 9. I'll let you read about Sally Jenkins. Just know that she is at the top of her game. She has the work ethic as a writer that she writes about. I love this quote. What is the athletic mindset? We're kind of into mindset these days. Carol Dweck wrote the book Mindset on growth mindset, not fixed mindset. We're going to do a book pretty soon in this series called Cultures of Growth about organizational mindset of growth. Well, here it's the athletic mindset. In this section of the handout, anything in italics is also directly from the book. All right. What is the athletic mindset? The laziest seeming pro athlete works much harder than the average person day in and day out to get better and is more forthright when it comes to confronting their unevenness under pressure. The longer I watch, the more I return to a question my father liked to pose rhetorically. He was also a great sports writer. Who can describe the athletic heart? He asked. The way he said it made me feel like it was the most important challenge in the world. The following is an effort to answer that challenge, to try to catalog the inner qualities that allow ordinary people to overcome pressures and elevate their performances and find champion identities, even when they don't always win. In reading, you may decide an athletic heart is worth acquiring for yourself. So many stories. At one point, Billie Jean King was coaching Martina Navratilova. Navratilova was stuck. And King said, I need to find out what you know and don't know. Why don't you start with which end of the racket you hold? Billie Jean King suggested. Confidence drops when technique is weak, Billie Jean King once declared. And I remember a story that I read somewhere 1,000 years ago about after a loss, Vince Lombardi, the great Green Bay Packers coach, got the team together and started his little speech this way. Gentlemen, this is a football. That was his opening line. You really have to work on the basics constantly. All right, here's a story about Pat Summitt. I love this one quote. I never once heard her blame anyone else for the final score. John Wooden never said to his team, let's go out and win this game. He never said that. So that's kind of interesting. Bob Iger, the CEO of Disney, he stays in shape. I don't, but he does. In reality, I'm reading, in the job I have, you're working about just every moment that you're awake. And under those circumstances, you have to protect yourself to maintain your mental and physical health. There are great stories of Michael Phelps and his coach, Bob Bowman. Bowman had an eclectic mix of expertise. He majored in classical music and minored in psychology as a swimmer at Florida State. And he brought both of those experiences to tutoring Phelps in how to perform under pressure. He wanted the swimmer to be like a pianist who practices measures on a piano until they are so memorized that he can play a piece with feeling and do so even under a bout of nerves while performing in public. Conditioning is about building an infrastructure. What we were doing in those laps in the early years, we're trying to build a physiological structure that will hold up to the stresses he's going to face down the road. When people are fatigued, the first thing that suffers is form. Boy, that's right. That's right. There's a great story about Tony Dungy, the coach, making the Colts, the Indianapolis team with Peyton Manning, practice with a wet ball. This is preparing for a Super Bowl in Miami. It doesn't rain in Miami, but he had them practice with a wet ball. And they won the Super Bowl in the rain in Miami, where it never rains that time of year. That's the wet ball practice. And the message and lesson there is you prepare for any and every eventuality. We can talk about Tom Brady and Bill Belichick's candor and his corrective measures. And here's a note to make to yourself. The great coaches and the great athletes worked on what they needed to fix. You know, this whole strengths-based leadership. There's a lot of advantage to that. But if somebody has a flaw and it's hurting the team or it's hurting their own performance, you've got to address the flaw. And this book is filled with stories about that. Peyton Manning had an obsession. I'm on the top of page 10. On the very first day after a season ended, Peyton Manning would meet at 7 a.m. with his quarterback's coach to watch tape of every interception he threw during the season. He worked on his flaws. Well, there's a story in the book about NASA astronauts and deliberate practice, and they have to rely on dirty practice, perhaps more committedly than any other organization because lives are at risk. I love the story about Pat Summitt and her how she bought a player a wristwatch. A player on her team was late to practice, and she pulled her aside and talked to her and discovered she had never owned a watch. And so she bought her a wristwatch and mentored her and coached her so that she could develop the discipline. Derek Jeter, over 2 decades, went to bed at the same time every night during the season. There's a great story, and there's a new movie about this, about Diana Nyad, who finally successfully swam from Cuba to Florida. And different people were shouting into her earpiece. And so they concluded that only one voice would shout into the earpiece and communicate with her. They had to have a clear, trusted communication channel. Steve Kerr, Greg Popovich, Phil Jackson, look at this quote, different approaches. Phil Jackson built a tribe, Greg Popovich, a family, that's the San Antonio coach, and Steve Kerr, a fun game. Well, I don't have time to tell you about the Harvard coach and his breakfast meetings, or Andy Reid and the 4 inches mistake. About the 10,000 hour rule. Malcolm Gladwell popularized this. It came from research by Anders Ericsson. Here's the key. You don't get great by putting in 10,000 hours. You get great by putting in the hours of deliberate practice. He was more, I'm reading near the bottom, Anders Ericsson was more concerned with the type of work required. That's really important. Turn to page 11. The one thing in common is they all had an incredible work ethic. Steph Curry had the hands of a logger. It was produced, he had his hands rubbed raw by 2,000 hours of practice shot, 2,000 practice shots a week, not 2,000 hours, 2,000 practice shots a week. If you're ambitious about something, why wouldn't you behave half as committedly about your ability as any athlete does? And there's a reason, this is bold, why Peyton Manning is as good at television as he was at quarterbacking. All right. Look here from the book, the categories and lessons and points: conditioning, practice, discipline, candor, facing your flaws, failure, culture, failure, and intention. Well, I've got major sections summarized, and you're going to have to read that on your own. Look at the bottom of page 13. Don't miss these lessons. I can't stress enough, she wrote, that champions are essentially the product of their own work. But also remember, the most successful had a combination of their great work ethic coupled with a focus on fixing mistakes, coupled with someone functioning as their coach. They wanted candor, they heeded their coaches. And Anders Ericsson said that the great ones spend 8 times a number of hours in practice under the analytical eye of coaches than just the same practice without the coach. Turn to the back. Mike told me to finish at 11:38 to 11:40, and I'm going to be 1 minute over. Some lessons and takeaways. Number 1, an observation. If you read this book carefully and dwell on the stories, you'll become a better and more appreciative sports watcher and fan. That was an unexpected result. Number 2, candor beats motivational pep talks. Put a star beside that. I didn't have time to read you a section in the handout about that, But motivational talks don't work like correcting mistakes. Number three, we are all in jobs that require discipline, conditioning, practice, candor, coaching, correction, skill development. Every one of us. Number four, leaders need to be teachers. And that means that leaders need to be students so they can learn to teach. Number five, practice, deliberate practice to get better will make you better at your next task, no matter what that task is. And number six, stay in good health and in good shape. You'll do better work that way. The right call, what sports teach us about work and life. I hope you found this useful. I'm turning it back over to Mike Mowry. Mike?
Great job, Randy. Man, what a great book this is. And I could go on and on about it, and I will in a minute. But, I want to say, Chris, I know you don't really love sports, but you have what this book talks about, the athlete's heart. I've seen that in working with you. What'd you get out of this book? What's one of your takeaways from this?
Gosh, I think my biggest takeaway after every book briefing is I wish I could soak it up for another hour, plus. And probably at the end of that hour, I'd want another hour. I just want it to keep, the information is so, I love how you break it down, summarize it, and make it digestible, because I can really learn something every single time Randy speaks into any sentence whatsoever. But it's funny, you mentioned good to great, because throughout the briefing, I kept that, like, the correlation, or at least the complementary nature of the two books kept jumping out to me. Just that, if you find, you want that athlete's heart and that dedication and that drive, but you also want to make sure that it's that passion and that they're in the right seat on the bus, so to speak. So I kept thinking back in the number of hours. I remember that so well, Randy, you talking about the number of hours it takes to be good at something and putting in the work and really staying focused on that. So that jumped out to me. And then I love Randy, I can't remember, I don't know if it was one of the written quotes, but you were talking about candor beats motivational speech.
Yeah.
And I thought that was just, like, to me, that was like a mind blown emoji, because that is so, I've seen that, I've felt that, I've seen it in other people where, when you get that candor from someone, it can really ignite that spark and help people get better at what they're doing. So I thought that was a really important quote as well. And I think we got a few comments in the chat also, Mike. We have one from Tommy. He says, Randy, thank you for another solid review and for making the time to share your insights. As leaders in our respective agencies, your lesson takeaway number 6 is something we all need to concentrate on. It seems our own health is usually the first thing we compromise and then work extra hard to make up for it. And when leaders demonstrate the importance of taking care of themselves, their teammates will see the example and perform better. Wow. Yeah. I could not agree more with that. And Mike, I'll turn it over to you, but I want to say one more thing really fast. Sorry.
Oh, no.
Because it really, when Tommy made that point, it just was another light bulb for me. But I messaged you, Mike, yesterday because I had this great conversation with Jennifer Fadden, our COO, and she really sets such a good example for people, for probably anyone she interacts with, but for employees as well. And she was talking about work-life balance and putting family first. And it just resonated with me. It was a great reminder to me, but it's not just, those aren't just words, she's not just saying that, she's living it and doing it and balancing her, responsibilities at home with her responsibilities at work and leading this awesome career in this great company, but also a great mom and wife and person. So I agree with that, Tommy. And I think it's important for leaders to set that example.
Yeah, I totally resonate with that too. And Randy, I want to ask you a question. When I first started studying leadership, sort of the one of the big waves was the major difference between leadership and managers. And leaderships, people were really exalted and appreciated. And at that point, maybe people kind of looked down at managers. And I've watched that pendulum swing back, and we kind of have a little more balance now where we understand if you're a good leader, you also have to be a good manager and vice versa. And I'm saying that because I'm wondering, I kind of think I see the same thing happening with strength-based leadership and your flaws. So we've had this cycle, right, where all the emphasis was on what are your strengths, don't worry about your weaknesses, but that has limits. And this book highlights it. And I wonder, in your opinion, do you think we're kind of shifting back to a better balance of like, yeah, you've got strengths, but you also have to make sure your flaws aren't hurting you? What's your thoughts on that?
I'm a little opinionated and biased about that question. I really do get it that people want to be affirmed. And if you say to somebody, hey, you're really good at this and keep it up, that makes them feel good. But I've done enough reading to know that the people who accomplish the most work on getting better at stuff they're not good at. And so, the athletics has so many examples. Michael Jordan, when he finished his junior year in college, went to his coach and said, I got one more year with you. What do I need to work on? And the coach said, well, you are going to be great at scoring, but your defense is a little not up to par. Spend your senior year working on defense. Well, he's the only player in NBA history to be the scoring champion for the year and the defensive player of the year. So there's a guy who knew that he could score, but he had to work on his defense. There are lots of stories like that in athletics. So I'm a fan of saying strengths-based is fine, but you've got to be a coach to point out the flaws and work on getting better at that. So I'm pretty high on that. And I think the books are beginning to say that more strongly, although the strengths-based people don't buy that.
Yeah. But so it's I think what I hear sometimes that resonates is don't let your weaknesses become fatal flaws. And to make sure that's the case, you gotta be at least average in it. So great review. Thank you so much. I want to just
Can I say one more thing?
Sure.
Casey Dowden is on. I don't know if I'm pronouncing Casey's last name, but Casey comes to us from Kentucky, and Casey works in the thoroughbred industry. We just had the Kentucky Derby photo finish. What a finish. And every year during these big three races, I go back and watch one of the videos of Secretariat, who still holds the track record for all three major races. And so I just wanted to say, if you want to talk about who's the greatest athlete of all time, you might want to make the case that it was Secretariat. That's my answer. So
I can't argue with that. Well, I hope Chris had just posted the link for next week's webinar. I hope you'll join us for that. I also want to just encourage you to Chris's point about wanting to hear more. You'll receive a link to the YouTube channel that'll have this posted on there along with all the other webinars, including Randy's book briefings. But if you really want to get these things into the way you lead, the way you work, you have to go over it again and again. And I really recommend that. You've got the handout, be like a Peyton Manning and sit down in that plane or wherever you are and just go over it again and go over it again until these thoughts and these concepts become embedded in the way you think. That's the way we all get better.
And let me say, these handouts, make copies for your team. Go over it with them. Circle the key quotes. Use these to lead a team meeting. That would be valuable to your team, I think.
Yeah. Well, we're out of time, but thanks, everyone. Thank you, Randy, so much. Krista, always great to work with you and see you. And to everyone that has been on this webinar, thank you for your time. Hope this has been helpful. If we can do anything for you to help you be more successful, please don't hesitate to reach out. And we will see you down the road.